Good afternoon, and welcome to the Akron Roundtable. I'm Angelina Milo, Board Chair and President of the Akron Roundtable Board of Directors. Today's program will be rebroadcast on WKSU 89.7 FM on Thursday, January 28th at 8 p.m. We're delighted that so many of you are able to join us today via virtual forum, and we sincerely thank the Akron Summit County Public Library for providing its talent and resources to make today's virtual event possible. Please mark your calendars for our next event, Thursday, February 18th, when we will host Dr. Marnie Walston of Akron Children's Hospital, who will present on the topic of childhood obesity. Today, it is our privilege to welcome to the roundtable stage Akron author, Mr. David Giffels, and WKSU News Director, Mr. Andrew Meyer. They will have a conversation about David's latest book, Barnstorming Ohio, to Understand America. You can read more about our roundtable speakers, as well as our Akron Roundtable podcast, by going to our website at akronroundtable.org. I'm fortunate to serve alongside an outstanding group of dedicated community leaders on the Akron Roundtable Board of Directors, a list of whom can be found on the website. Should you have any questions or suggestions regarding Akron Roundtable, please feel free to contact any member. Today, I would like to particularly thank Karen Talbot for her leadership of serving on the board as board chair and president of the Akron Roundtable for the past 2 years. Karen, thank you so much for your excellent leadership, your vision, and your dedication to Akron Roundtable. Karen is joining us virtually today, so it'll be my honor to deliver to her a contemplative son for her service and dedication to the Akron Roundtable. Again, thank you so much, Karen. Akron Roundtable is grateful for the generous support it receives from sponsors, patrons, and subscribers. You too may financially support our virtual forum by going to our website to make a contribution. We thank you for your consideration. During today's event, we'll be using Asker technology, which enables you to submit questions via mobile devices. Questions can be submitted at any time and will be forwarded for review during our question and answer portion of the program. Watch the screen for instructions should you need them. Mr. Andrew Meyer, News Director for the WKSU, will serve as moderator of today's presentation. Following the moderated discussion, Andrew and David have generously agreed to take questions from the virtual audience. Andrew will also coordinate that portion of the program. Again, please remember that during our program, you may submit questions at any time on your device through Asker technology. And now I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Angelina, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I first learned that David was at work on his new book through a social media post. It was sometime latter part of 2019, and he basically wrote that he was embarking on a journey throughout Ohio to learn more about the people, the places in Ohio, and how they could serve as potentially an indicator of the mood nationally in this country as we were approaching the next elections. Now, I had gotten to know David personally, both through previous interviews that I'd done with him and through his previous books. I reached out and I said, hey, why don't we touch base on a regular basis and have a regular conversation about what he was finding. And he was extremely gracious in his response, and thus was born a series of monthly conversations on WKSU. I feel really lucky to have had that opportunity, and when he reached out just about a month ago, I was thrilled that we'd have at least one more opportunity to chat about Barnstorming Ohio. And without further ado, let's get right to the questions about the book. And David, it's great to see you. First off, congratulations, you survived the elections.
And so did you, and it's great to see you again, too.
A lot has happened since the book was published in August. But let's talk about the original conceit for the book for those who haven't had a chance to read it. The basis for the book was that Ohio could serve as that microcosm for the country in the 2020 election. Where did the idea come from?
You know, the idea had its genesis in a conversation I had with my agent right after the 2018 midterm elections. And we were talking about what I was going to work on next, and ironically, one of the things that had happened during the review cycle for my previous book, Furnishing Eternity, is I got tagged by the New York Times Book Review as, quote, the Bard of Akron, which is a title I am proud of, and I think I probably come by honestly because I've written about Akron, my hometown, and my home place, and the larger Rust Belt region for most of my career. It's become my topic, but I also felt like I wanted to kind of move, further afield and do something different. And he kept pushing. He said, "Yeah, but Ohio has so much to say, and we're in this moment of this historic moment of division and uncertainty and identity crisis. And why don't you go back to Ohio in a different way with a different look?" And of course, I end up with a book with Ohio in the title, so I didn't get away from it at all. But he reminded me of what important things Ohio has always had to say, not just politically, but about us as a people. And I was reminded specifically of a project I did leading up to as a columnist for the Akron Beacon Journal leading to the 2004 election, when I went traveling the state for a couple of months leading to that presidential election. And what I came away with was not so much an understanding of a political process, but a better understanding of Americans, just real people who were not just being asked how they were going to vote by a pollster, but really trying to understand their lives. And I wanted to do that on a larger scale. And I do want to say, you're just reaching out to talk about this as I was just really kind of getting deep into the project. The project spanned March of 2019, I set off, and the book was completed March of 2020, so it covers 1 year. And you showed up kind of in the middle of that year. And the opportunity to talk with you as I was undergoing my research and my travel and my interviews was an opportunity to really think more deeply. And your questions were so good that they brought out truths that are in this book that would not have been there if it was not for that chance to talk about it with you and get your sort of back and forth on it. So thank you for doing that and continuing this conversation.
You're welcome, and I am humbled. The basic idea here is looking at Ohio through what's been referred to by the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron as the 5 Ohios. And that's really how you approached your journeys throughout the state. Can you, for those who aren't familiar with that concept, lay out the basic elevator pitch on what are the 5 Ohios?
Sure. I express a lot in the book about my true belief that Ohio is quintessentially American. And I write in the book that Ohio is no more American than any other place, but it is completely so. And so that was what I wanted to explore on a sort of thematic and spiritual basis. But there is sort of quantifiable research done by much smarter and more educated people than me that shows how Ohio has 5 regions that break down distinctly from one another. And each of those regions reflects one part of the American culture and specifically one part of the electorate. They vote in different patterns. They have different self-contained units of traditional media. Their culture, their geography, their economies are different. And briefly, they break down like this. There's the northeast part of the state where we live, sort of industrial, post-industrial, very diverse, very urban, much more like the American East. There's the northwest part of Ohio, which is much more the true American Midwest. It's flatter, it's more dominated by farming, more dominated by a different kind of political thought. There is southwest Ohio, dominated by Cincinnati, a much more southern feel to it, a more conservative, a different kind of urban experience. there's Southeast Ohio, the Appalachian region, which is obviously its own kind of unique animal, and then there's Central Ohio, which has more of a suburban, more, it's more like the Arizona of Ohio, a sort of a growing, the only truly growing city in the state. Also with the influence of Ohio State University and a younger, more kind of vibrant tone to it. And so you take each of these individually, and they have stories to tell, and then hopefully I was able to get kind of beyond just looking for types that fit each of those places, but to try to find individuals who would speak for themselves as Americans and give that sense of Americanness that I believe is here.
There are distinct differences among the five Ohios, but certainly you found commonalities among the five Ohios, things that are shared. What were they?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I really reflected on at the end of this book is the places that I found that really kind of I could see as holding certain kinds of truths that were uniform were small towns. It just seems like people in small towns kind of represent some of everything in a region, whereas the big cities are their own kind of place, and suburbs are their own kind of place, but small towns are, I don't want to say it's where real folks live, but it is, there's something about it. And what I found, I think the one thing that I found the most that still remains true even after all that's happened in the months since this book came out is a sense of people just wanting to be heard, because there's so much noise, there's so much social media siloing that goes on, where even when you are using your voice in social media, you're doing it in an echo chamber for the most part. And during a political season, Ohioans are so used to people descending upon the state from outside to ask them questions that serve a purpose that's their own and not that of the person being asked. And I felt this real sense of, at first, wariness about what my questions were really after, and then relief that what they were really after was, tell me about your life and not how you're going to vote. And I think there's a real yearning in the less heard middle, which is most of us in America, just to be heard on our own ground and to speak of our own lives, and not to be immediately cast into a political corner or a social corner or a cultural corner that we aren't allowed to, sort of not be, more complex than.
Let's jump to the present day. The book was published in August. The reporting obviously ended somewhat before then, but after the pandemic started. Mm-hmm. Everything that's happened since then, the election, the insurrection, the inauguration, the second impeachment, has that put anything you wrote about in the book that you reported on in a different light for you?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that sort of like forced me to think like, how is what I found to be true in the book was the pandemic, because the book ends basically the day the pandemic begins. March 15th is the day that the book ends in terms of the timeline, and that's kind of the day that that the world changed, and so the first thing that became true to me is that many of the things that I believed about Ohio, which is primarily that what we have to teach to the rest of the nation comes from us having lived through hard times. And all of a sudden, the country was cast into hard times. So the pandemic, a public health crisis, everybody's looking for how to deal with it. Well, Ohio had been dealing with the opioid crisis, a public health crisis, for a number of years, and we had lessons to teach. And then racial strife, and one of the chapters in the book addresses Cincinnati's response to the shooting of Timothy Thomas, a young black unarmed teenager shot by a white police officer in 2001, and how Cincinnati responded to it more than just waiting for it to be over, but responding proactively. We had something to teach from the hard times we had come from. The pandemic cast countless Americans into economic crisis. Well, if you want to learn how to deal with economic crisis, come to the Rust Belt. We've been dealing with it for 2 generations. So I felt like those truths were holding fast, and then we got hit with this chaos of everything that's happened around the election and after. And I think the thing that's emerging for me now is what I found across the 4,000 miles I traveled and the more than 100 people that I interviewed and this whole experience is this common sense. And it seems like a cliche to say that there's a middle American common sense, but cliches are there because they're true. And when you rediscover them and you find new truths in them, I think they continue to have value. And I would say that one thing that I found almost universally in all of the people I talked to was some version of what I would call common sense. People who have been listening and paying attention and have come to grips with how they see the world in a way that makes sense for them that we could learn from. And so, we're seeing such extremes. So that riot at the Capitol those were extremists. Well, one thing I wonder is what version of that part of the political spectrum that's not at the far end of the extreme has some version of common sense in it, and by the same token at the other end of the spectrum. Because I think right now, the unheard middle is this phrase that keeps recurring to me. There's so many of us who consider ourselves more moderate, more centrist, and it's most of us, and those voices aren't being heard over all the clamor.
If you were given the opportunity to put out a revised edition of the book with everything that's happened since its original publication date, other than referencing what happened, would you change anything? Has your perspective at all changed?
It's weird because obviously I had no idea this book was going to end with a pandemic, a global catastrophe, which certainly provided a dramatic ending for the book that I didn't know was going to be there. But now it's like the number of dramatic catastrophes that have cascaded across the course of the year that has followed has made me think, you could write this book every year and you'd have all new material. I don't think I would do anything differently because the one driving purpose of the book was to allow people to speak for themselves. So whatever the conditions are of the moment, I think allowing people to speak for themselves is only going to give you a new stripe of the same truth that they're giving, regardless or in response to what's happening in the moment, but still maintain that same kind of common sense truth that I kept finding again and again.
I asked you about this back when the book was released, about your favorite stops around Ohio, the most memorable people that you met along the way. What's changed since then, given the perspective of the last 4 months? Have you been back in touch with any of the sources you spoke with during the book?
Yeah, I haven't been back in touch in a formal way, but there's one person in the book who I spent more time with than anybody else. And it's a young man named Leonte Cooper. He's from Akron. He right out of high school, didn't have any sense of direction, joined the military, immediately got into a lot of trouble, and was facing a potential dishonorable discharge. And he just sort of single-handedly decided to take control of his life. He underwent a religious conversion. He cleaned up his act. He ended up leaving with an honorable discharge, came back to Akron, moved into the Spring Hill apartments, the Section 8 apartments where LeBron James once lived, and enrolled at Stark State to try to start his college in an affordable way. And I talked to him over the course of the whole year I was reporting this book, and by the end of that year, he was leaving for college at Ohio State to continue his education. And so he really was growing up before my eyes. And one reason he was such an important character to me is because he's right at the same age as my own children, who are also in the book. And I felt like in each of their cases, those stories were the most important to me because the older I get, and especially the more I think about it in the way I was writing about these moments in the book, the more I was feeling like my vote and my political life has less to do with me and more to do with my own children. It's a more of a generational cast to my thinking than the next 4 years. And so Cooper not only was, he goes by Cooper because the military drilled his last name into him. He was an attractive figure not only because of that, but because specifically he wanted to study political science and he wanted to commit his life to Ohio and to making Ohio better. All of these notes of optimism and ambition that were playing into it. And so the last conversation I had with him was late in my reporting. I went down and spent some time with him on campus, and he had seemed so hopeful and full of possibility at the beginning of this, and so much had happened. And I asked, and he had found on campus as a political science major that he was not comfortable using his voice. He was not comfortable often expressing his political opinions. And this is in political science classes. And I asked him if he still felt the same optimism. And he thought a long time before he answered. And he gave an answer I can't do justice to, but it's in the book. But ultimately at the end he said, yes, I'm still hopeful because I have to believe that if I'm putting my faith in the ideals that I believe in, that they will come true. So I had a chance to reconnect with him recently. We, Leadership Ohio, a leadership group about Ohio, brought together a panel of, included mostly politicians. Frank LaRose was a panelist, but we invited Cooper, and I was on the panel, and got to see his face and hear his voice post-election. And most of it was, that young, wide-eyed, wow, that was crazy kind of response. But also this really thoughtful voice of somebody who I don't think is corrupted yet, saying, basically, for all of the rancor and chaos and division, we came through it. He really still believed in democracy, and it was just great to hear it from his voice, especially knowing him the way I knew him.
You mentioned your daughter. It's a personal story. It's not just talking to new people that you've discovered across Ohio, but your family is part of this, and certainly your daughter is an important chapter in this. Your daughter, in 2016, thought she'd be electing the first woman to be president, and the story is part of the book. This part isn't obviously in the book. Now, the first woman as vice president has been sworn in. What are the conversations that you and your daughter have had about what's happened in history and how that relates to her feelings about what happened 4 years ago now?
Yeah, it's funny because she's in the book because I was writing about the changing role of women in the electorate, and also, just how much Hillary Clinton's presence kind of broke a glass ceiling, partly, cracked it, and this change. And I wanted, as a reporter, I wanted to talk to a young woman about her experience. And sometimes in reporting, we reach for the low-hanging fruit. And I thought, well, I live in a house with a young woman who voted for the first time at age 18 in an election that put the first mainstream female candidate against the most, I write in the book, the most openly misogynistic one. It gave her this stark choice. And we had never really talked directly about politics. It wasn't something we had avoided. It just never had been something in our conversation. And so I just sort of started interviewing her, and immediately heard this thoughtful response that I had never really tapped into. And so I was really rewarded and interested by that. So very close to the election, the First Lady's Library in Canton invited me and my daughter to have a conversation about the upcoming election. And it was a second chance, and she had left for graduate school at Ohio University. So the first thing was I got to Zoom with my daughter for an hour, just an excuse to spend time with her. But the other thing was I got to engage her in that conversation again in a way that, this, an interview is ultimately an artificial conversation. But when you're interviewing your daughter, it's a chance to sort of ask questions that you might not ask over breakfast, but we could really engage. And I heard this new, hope and optimism that she got another chance to vote for a female to national office. And then talking to her, this week certainly, and post-election, how excited she is that, there's so many versions of there's someone like me in the White House, there's someone like me in the cabinet. Biden has done such a deliberate job of populating his cabinet with people from new versions of the American spectrum. And so for my daughter to see a female vice president, it's directly impactful to her. Not to say, I mean, and so much more so for black and brown people and people of ethnicities and the whole spectrum of American life is on display in the White House. It's beautiful.
I'd like to start to work in some of the questions coming in from our virtual audience.
Sure.
One of them is concerning the 5 Ohios. And the questioner asked, in the light of the distinctions you observed along Ohio's regions, what are your hopes or concerns about the loaded term unity that we're hearing a lot about this month?
Yeah. Everyone from Ohio would refer to themselves as an Ohioan, but I think most of us would have our own version of what that means. And so, Ohio should be able to celebrate its diversity, and have somebody who lives in the Ohio Valley say, nobody listens to me about gun rights. Nobody listens to me, about my frustration, my economic frustration, and not have that marginalize them against, like a liberal college professor in Akron, Ohio, for instance. That we should be able to, celebrate a diversity that's messy, and so the word unity, I'm glad for it because we're lacking it, but unity has to admit and accept that it's putting together people who don't agree.
A question about Ohio's role in national presidential elections. We've heard all about, this is my part of this, not the question asker, about how no Republican candidate for the White House has won the presidential election without winning Ohio. This was certainly an exception this year, as Trump easily took Ohio, but then lost the national election. The questioner asked, in a national election, given the results of 2020, does Ohio matter the way it has in the past?
That's a good question, and one distinction I think it's important to make is the difference between a bellwether and a battleground. And I think Ohio remains a bellwether. I think Ohio's makeup continues to tell the national story in that way. But the battlegroundness of Ohio, I think, is something that political scientists and political operatives need to take a hard look at, because the elevator pitch for this book was since the 19th century, Ohio has sided with the winner in the presidential election in 29 of 31 elections. We were only wrong twice. Well, now we've been wrong 3 times. I can still say, well, we've only been wrong 3 times, but the fact is that the numbers say that we are moving in a direction that seems to be leaning red. So, I think, I was on a different panel with Sherrod Brown right after the election. It was the weekend after Election Day. And he said, and this, I think I asked him the question, I said, what do you make of what happened in the Mahoning Valley, where people thought that the traditional Union Democrats who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, that was an anomaly. And my reporting said the same thing. Every person I talked to, out of work UAW workers who had been laid off at Lordstown, who had voted for Donald Trump but had voted twice for Barack Obama before that, said they would not vote for Donald Trump again. So I really thought that the Mahoning Valley was going to revert to its old pattern, and it didn't. And Sherrod Brown said that's the one, that this was sort of immediately after he said that's the one we need to get under, because he couldn't understand it either. So, I think those are things that we need to look at. And then also, Ohio is one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. And so I think some of our political makeup is deceptive and not necessarily reflective of our true self. So those are things I think should be addressed by the people who address those things. And then, we should wonder, some of what's happening in Ohio is also demographic. It's slowly aging, and it's slowly becoming less diverse, while other places are becoming more diverse and younger. And what's happening to our overall, sort of glacial growth.
One of the questions we got actually touches on what you just mentioned about the Mahoning Valley becoming more potentially congruent with southeast Ohio than with northeast Ohio, given the way that it flipped for Trump the last two elections. Do you believe, as you were referencing your conversation with Senator Brown, that that really is the likelihood?
I'm not enough of a political scientist to go beyond what I know from my own reporting and my own experience. But the question that resonated, and really, as I worked on the book, the question that became more and more true and more true in every situation, is the question I was being asked different versions of, which is, who will listen to me? And I think in both of those cases, the kind of person we're talking about is the person who has not felt listened to for a long time and has felt talked to, told who they were by people of greater power for a long time. And so in that way, they share a similarity, because the worker whose vote has been taken for granted by Democrats for so long, who finds a new power in their vote, must have felt listened to, in a way that Democrats should pay attention to. People, especially poor people in Appalachia, in the Ohio Valley, have never been listened to. And when they at least felt like they got some attention, well, what kind of attention can they be given that will really reward them in a way that's not just a cynical grab for their vote, but an understanding of a part of America that doesn't have as much power, doesn't have as much of a pulpit?
Another questioner asked whether you learned anything new or have any significant revelations about your hometown of Akron as a result of writing the book.
I've written and thought and pontificated so much about my hometown that I actually tried to avoid spending too much time here. I wrote about rolling acres and the larger phenomenon of Amazon taking over dead malls, especially in the Midwest and Great Lakes region. But I think everything that's in this book is informed by Akron, because Akron's my true place, and it's the place that ultimately has helped me understand myself. It's my place, and my self-definition are intertwined completely. So Akron's in every aspect of this book. So I can't say that I came to understand it differently, but I hope and think that I came to understand it even more deeply.
And I would say certainly the perspective of family plays a role in that as well. We mentioned your daughter previously. Your son is a relatively new member of the Akron Police Department at a time of racial and social calls for racial and social justice.
Yeah, and I must say, life goes on beyond the 300th page of a book. And so my son has actually recently transitioned. He's now a full-time Cuyahoga Falls firefighter. So continuing the same pursuit of public service and public safety, but life goes on. But yeah, the reason I wanted to tell my children's own stories, because they're both, each in their own way, making their commitment to Ohio as their home, and to Akron and this region as their home. And that was the most important thing. His commitment is to helping people. And my daughter is studying physical therapy at Ohio University and wants to return to Northeast Ohio when she graduates. They both want to commit their talent and their optimistic spirit to help other people to their place. And that's incredibly rewarding to me, because everything I've written about place, everything I've written about Akron in this region, has been to try to rethink the notion of brain drain, the notion of us losing our best and brightest, especially young people, to places that seem to offer more promise. And so to see two people from my own family independently make that decision is rewarding to me personally, but it also is, I hope, can offer a lesson and a reason to do it to other people.
Two questions coming in related to brain drain and how we attract the next generation to be here in Ohio, how we convince the next generation to stay here. One of them comes from a questioner who says, "What do I say to my liberal granddaughter from Boston who might like to consider a college in Ohio but has trouble with the state being so red?"
Um, it's still more affordable than Boston, and the traffic is better. And I think what we, I can't, I think it's easier to to think locally and even almost by the neighborhood, and so Akron it does this well, but needs to continue to do it and even get better at it. Is to promote what is attractive about Akron that we recognize, and sometimes we have to be reminded of by people who come here from other places, that we are a city that's small enough to feel like a small town, big enough to feel like a big city, with access to even bigger city resources in Cleveland, that's surrounded by a national park, that has these assets and this new generation of leadership that I hope offers a kind of energy that would be attractive to someone like that, where you could afford to live and have a lifestyle, a quality of life that is in some ways more difficult in cities that do seem more glamorous and attractive.
Sandra Kurt submitted a question concerning the state becoming older and less diverse. Was curious about your interviews with the younger Ohioans that you spoke with over the course of the book, and how they reflected a desire to stay in the state or search elsewhere for a new home. And can you share just a little bit of what you found in your journeys?
Yeah, and hi, Sandra. There's there's a really I don't think it's overlooked. I've been aware of it for a long time. I think most people are aware of it. There's a real kind of hardscrabble pride among younger people. My book, The Hard Way on Purpose, is about my experience as the first generation of people in the industrial Midwest who grew up never knowing its industrial heyday and only knowing the downslide, the Rust Belt years. There's a new generation now of people who didn't really experience the true Rust Belt, but they recognize a hardscrabble pride in a place that's been through hard times. They recognize the music of the blues that is played by cities like Akron, and they think it's cool, and cool not in a sort of superficial way, but they recognize the value of authenticity and the value of having some scars and some patina, and so when they say that they're proud to be from Akron, the ones who don't immediately want to get out and leave and go somewhere else feel kind of what I felt a generation before, which is a pride in having stayed and got it out in a place that sort of rewards you for sticking to it. There's an aspect of loyalty here that, and when I say here, I mean in places like this as well, that is that feels much more earned. It's easy to be loyal. I love Chicago. But it's easier to be loyal to Chicago because it's glossier and it's more glamorous and it's got more amenities. It's harder to be loyal. I've said this before. Akron's like a three-legged dog. Like if you have a three-legged dog and it loves you, it loves you completely because it needs you. And Akron's like that. Akron needs you. Akron needs everybody pulling and everybody committing to it. And once you commit to something, you're much more invested. And so your pride is much more meaningful.
Here's a question on the flip side. Do you think it's possible for one to find too much of their identity in the place that they live? Are there hazards if most of a community's leaders define too much of their identity by their hometown?
No, because especially now, because America has become so homogenized, and especially I think this has been intensified by the pandemic, where we've done so much of our buying, so much of our economic power has been used with no thought to where something comes from, where something was made. It could come from across the world or across the county, and it doesn't make any difference. And so it becomes all the more important, I think, to think locally and to be cognizant of the value of uniqueness of place, because we're losing our individual identities as Americans as we become more homogenous and as we get our information from more and more sort of uniform sources that only tell us one thing. So local news remains, I think, the most important source of news because it cares about you. And local purchasing power means so much more because you're supporting somebody in your community who's, we're seeing this, any of us, I think most of us know somebody who owns a restaurant. We are seeing the value of our dollar there versus at a chain restaurant. So I think the more local, the better. I don't think there's anything parochial about that, or I don't think parochialism should be a bad word.
You brought up gerrymandering a little while ago. We're looking at a redistricting cycle now with both state legislative and congressional seats being redrawn within the next 2 years for the next elections. This questioner asked, do you think the voices of the young hopefuls wanting to be heard will impact a change in gerrymandering in the foreseeable future?
Do I think our politicians listen to us is really what that question is, and our leaders. Yes, I hope so, is what I would say.
Next question. As a university professor, you have a particular perspective. You teach at the University of Akron, for those who aren't aware. Can you speak to the quality of education Ohio students are getting as they rise through public and higher education?
I can only speak from my own experience. I teach at a state university, so I teach classes. I teach creative writing primarily, and my undergraduate creative writing classes are made up of everything from functional illiterates to people who are ready for an MFA program in creative writing. There's a broad spectrum, and so I can see students who I think have arrived in my classroom, honestly, who aren't ready to be there, and who either should have other ways to put other places to put their talents and their ambitions, or be better prepared. And I can see students who are coming to the classroom who are impeccably prepared. And I can't say where those rivers flowed from, but I can say that I see a broad spectrum of preparation.
There are so many places you went during the travels for this book. You went to Cincinnati. You spent time in the Mahoning Valley, in Youngstown. You went to the Bellwether Festival in Dayton. You went to farm country, all over the place. We have a listener or viewer who asked about whether you spent any time in Cleveland. They're specifically curious about news that black voter turnout was weak. And I'm not sure if they're referring to this current election cycle in 2020 or that was also low in 2016, but both are true.
Yeah, I don't have perspective on the voting patterns in Cleveland, on the voter turnout. Yes, I spent time in Cleveland. Kind of a lot of different themes kind of touched into Cleveland, and Cleveland and Akron, I think, are so alike that much of what I wrote about Akron and Cleveland are kind of informed by the other. In terms of how the vote played out, it's hard for me to say. However, Cleveland is a city whose high African American population is very important to the electorate, obviously, and to electorate patterns. In 2004, I mentioned before, when I did my travels across the state, I did some research and found the place in Ohio that had cast the most votes for the Republican candidate in 2000 for George Bush, and the place that had voted the highest number of Democratic votes for Al Gore. And there was a precinct in Cleveland where 100% of the vote was Democratic, in downtown Cleveland. I think it's such a striking difference to Putnam County in northwest central Ohio, farm region, where it was like 96% for the Republican candidate. Those are huge divides, not that far apart. So what do we understand about Cleveland?
Question for me about journalists covering politics. We face the eternal challenge of how we tell the story of politics, how we report on the issues that matter most to people without watching their eyes glaze over, their ears seal up, or these days, especially the partisan divide getting in the way of sharing the information, the stories that we're telling. What do you think you've learned from your travels around the state, and now the hindsight of what's happened since then, that give you some perspective on advice that you'd offer to share with us other journalists when it comes to covering government and politics?
Always find the people who would not otherwise be asked the questions. We're always going to go to the power brokers, and they're always going to get their attention, and they should. I mean, we should know what they have to say, but and this isn't new, but it was only reinforced by this experience, is that I've always been rewarded by writing and interviewing and meeting with people who would not have been asked these questions otherwise.
We've got time for just a few more questions, I believe. You spent a lot of time researching the book, a lot of time reporting on this, and you gathered a lot of stories, and I know you gathered stories more than what actually made it into the book. So you want to share anything about what ended up on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, I think I've told this story before. I may have told it when we talked last time, but there was only one person who directly turned me down for an interview, and it was Michael Simon, the Iron Chef Michael Simon. And I reached out, and it was because I wanted him to talk about Ohio sweet corn. I was writing about farming, and I wanted to just do sort of a reverie, an aside about just waxing poetic about the glories of Ohio sweet corn, which, I'm sorry, America, but you have good corn, but nobody has corn as good as Ohio. And I wanted him to make that point. And I don't know if it was too controversial a question. He couldn't handle the hardball question from me, or he was just too busy. But he turned me down, and I was disappointed. But I did get to ask my old friend Jane Snow, the longtime food editor at the Beacon Journal, the same question, and she answered it.
Are there aspects of the stories that you did tell that made it into the book that you did, there were certain elements that didn't make it into the book that you would have liked to?
Not so much. I mean, this book was a unique experience just from a writing and reporting standpoint. I had 1 year from zero to finished to do it, so pretty much everything I got went into the book. It's interesting, even now, just a short time after its publication, to think about where else I could have gone and what else I might have done. And those are things that are true of any writing project, but especially one that's done in a sort of condensed and intense fashion like this one.
I think one last question from me.
All
Gotta
right.
drop the S word. Sequel?
Sequel. Honestly, Andrew, I think every 2 months since March of last year when I finished reporting, I could have probably done a full sequel to this book. There is no sequel planned, but I never know what I'm going to do next.
Never say never.
Never say never.
David Giffels, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure again.
Andrew, it has been a true pleasure, not just today, but for the past year plus.
Thanks.
David and Andrew, thank you so much for being with us today. David, on behalf of the Akron Roundtable, it's my pleasure to present to you this contemplative sun. This celebratory work of art was designed exclusively for the Akron Roundtable by local artist Don Drum. Thank you again.
Thank you. Can I, real quick, this is my third time doing the roundtable, so I feel like I need, before my career ends, to do it one more time so I have enough of those to do a dinner party.
Absolutely. You got it. And thank all of you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you next month in February, again, via virtual forum. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.